we can all appreciate this little dip in the weather before we roll into some of the warmer months. So I know a handful of you just small town and just making the connections, seeing people walking across the street and stuff. But for those I haven't met, I'm looking forward to meeting in person. My name is Brian O. I am 8 months in as your Director of Community Development. And so I have the fortunate opportunity to work with our planning staff, many of them here, the general plan consulting team led by Ron Whitmore from Ramey and Associates, and then working closely with our housing and building divisions as well. And so we're a growing department. We're evolving, and I think one thing that was a particular draw for me was, being able to work on the general plan in my backyard, and sort of build that legacy out for not just my kids, but for our community. And so I'm so appreciative of everyone's time here, spending your evenings once a month, plus all the time that goes into it. And it's something that's obviously near and dear to the community's hearts. And so again, thank you for just sharing your wide breadth of knowledge and expertise and interest in improving our community. And so with that, I will, not sure who's controlling. Oh, Ron's going to go again. It's like just some housekeeping items. So we are recording. There's interpretation. This will also be available on demand, just like any of our meetings. And so I'll pause here for introduction to both Monica and Maria.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Me llamo Mónica. Estoy aquí con mi pareja de interpretación, María. Estamos aquí hoy como intérpretes. Hoy este evento se llevará a cabo en español e inglés. Se usarán ambos idiomas activamente, así que usted podrá elegir un canal para participar en su idioma preferido después de que le hayamos explicado cómo funcionará la interpretación. Estaremos usando la función de interpretación de Zoom. Después de que termine esta explicación, se activará la función de interpretación. Si usted está conectado con su computadora, usted verá un icono de un mundo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Si usted está conectado con su tableta o teléfono, pulse el más y verá un menú que incluye la opción de interpretación de idiomas. Para escuchar la interpretación, pulse el icono del mundo o interpretación de idiomas y a continuación elija el canal de su idioma. Thank you. We're ready.
Thank you, Monica. So before we jump in, I would love to see who's here. Roll call. And so I'll just start from the top and just address or acknowledge, be creative. Besides just the here. Okay, Dave Alden.
Be creative.
Thanks, Dave, for being here. Stephanie Blake. Let's see her. Phil Boyle.
Here, present.
Hey, Phil. And Aaron Chmielewski. And Mary Dooley.
You're late.
There we go. Thank you, Mary. Nice to see you and hear from you. Jesse is absent, and Allie.
Allie's here.
Hey, Allie. Are you back from leave?
Nope, I'm not. I still have a few more weeks, thankfully.
All right. Well, thanks for being here. With such an important time spending with your family. Yancy Jacoby.
It's Jacobo and hey.
All right. Hey. Thank you. Sharon Kirk.
Hello.
Hello, Sharon. Roger.
Here in mind and body.
Mind and body. Ileana. And Roberto. And Brent.
Here.
And And Chris.
Yo,
Joe. What flavor was that ice cream?
it's a little chocolate, a little vanilla, just nothing too fancy, but just
Good.
enough for a little lift, pre-meeting lift.
Good to see you, Bill.
I'm here. I'm in transit though, so I'm going to be off camera for a little bit, but I should be back to the office soon. So see you then.
Yeah, not a problem. Thanks, Bill. And Joshua.
Here, queer, and glad to be getting back into the swing of things.
Alrighty, welcome, Josh. Elda. And Lizzie. And last but not least, Bill Wolbert.
Here I am.
All right. Over email and over Zoom. Over the last couple hours there, I think we've been emailing on our project. Okay, well, thanks everyone. And then let's, before we jump into it, can we just, let's see, who else is here? I'm gonna just do a quick introduction. We had our interpreters. Looks like there's a few of us joining from the public as well. And the consulting team. Great, I think we're all here. All right, next slide, Ron.
Thank you, Brian, and good to see everybody. Hope you've enjoyed your summer. Just a few additional housekeeping items before we jump in. As usual, if you have any technical difficulties, please email Daniel, our Zoom host tonight. The email address is on this slide. Likewise, if you're having any trouble with interpretation, please contact Maria at the email address on the screen. And this is the regular reminder to people like Ron to please speak slowly. Makes the job of the interpreters much easier. Likewise, for all of us planners, please try to avoid using acronyms. Derek, there's a number of acronyms I know in your presentation, so when you first come to them, please make sure you spell them out. But otherwise, let's do what we can to make the important work that the interpreters are doing as easy as possible. So the front end of the meeting is pretty consistent with how we typically handle the GPAC meetings, get through the logistics, open it up for general public comment. Staff then have some project and other city updates related to the general plan. The main item tonight, and featuring our guest speaker, Derek Braun from Strategic Economics, is a summary of the methods and key findings from a couple important housing related analyses. Derek will give us a presentation based on the reports that were sent to you last week. We'll then pause, actually for some, sorry, one thing is missing here. We'll pause for questions from the GPAC, just clarifying questions, not discussion, questions, and then we'll open it up to public comment before bringing it back for the topic specific GPAC discussion. And then we wanted to hold a little bit of time at the end, as Brian already mentioned, to talk about working groups and what we have in mind for them in the near future. And then explain how we'd like to hear from folks after the meeting about their level of interest in different working group topics. So Daniel, at this point, I will stop sharing screen and turn it over to you for general public comment.
Great. Thank you, Ron and all. So at this point, we'll go ahead and start general public comment. So if any members of the public who are on this call, please utilize the raised hand Zoom feature, and you'll have 3 minutes for your public comment. At this point, I don't see any hands raised, but we'll give it a moment. So Ron, it looks like at this time there's no public commenters, so I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
And I will turn it back over to Brian to take us through the project and staff updates.
Thanks, Ron. So as you get the PowerPoint slide pulled up. I think just with some of that formality, I think that was sort of the typical structure. I mean, I would encourage any member of not just the committee, but members of the public that are here or may listen to the recording to just reach out, right? If there's any questions or any comments that any community member has, please just feel free to reach out directly. All right, project and staff updates. Next slide, Ron. Okay, so the roadmap hasn't been this quite this delineated and uniform, but many of you have been through this process with us, and so with the city, and so we just wanted to take a moment here just to reflect on all the work that has been done, all the input, whether it's through the working groups to help create some draft policy frameworks that we're looking to bring back and share with this group. A lot of work has been done as part of the general plan update. There's absolutely a lot more that needs to be done, and we'll talk a little bit and sort of highlight some of the things that we're looking as a look ahead. But we're sort of in this phase here between policy development and then getting us on track to start talking about alternatives. So this is the big, engagement point with the community to really understand, how the community at large wants to grow, wants to evolve the city through this general plan process. And so if this is a critical moment, so again, just wanted to share just some gratitude with this group for your participation. And so we are still, the initial calendar is, obviously outdated at this point, but if we can hit these marks where we're talking alternatives, again, we'll share some dates at the end of this presentation, but then we can really get, roll up the sleeves, start developing the plan, start looking at a draft plan, talking to our neighbors, talking to the community. And so, we feel like we're on a good path, and today's going to be a really critical point to put us in the right direction. Next slide. So part of that windiness is general plan has been all encompassing, right? And so with the successful certification of our housing element, that again was a key part of the general plan update, as is all things climate. And so this is just to talk through some of that. So we had the climate emergency framework that was passed by the city council, and that really identified a nice course for city staff to embark on. And so we have a number of meetings here and then a request here in red that we'll get to in a moment. But really the big release is going to be the action plan, a public draft for community review. It will be accompanied with a number of ways to engage with the community, whether it's through open house, content on our website, ways to interact online, as well as a focused effort with our climate advisory committee. And so, Josh, I see your hand. Let me just finish this part. So one of the things that we are looking for, and maybe you're raising your hand for this, we're looking for 2 volunteers that will spend roughly a month as part of a joint general plan advisory committee and a climate advisory committee ad hoc to review the action plan and while it's in draft form. So just think about that and think about if that's, whether it's yourself or someone on the committee that is not joining us today, that may be a good fit for that. And then sort of overarching themes is, how do we make sure that all these parallel efforts, whether it's the climate action plan, whether it's the active transportation plan, general plan update, all of the ongoing policies that we are working on as a city, to get to those carbon neutral goals, to get to those climate goals. How are these all working in lockstep? There's going to be a lot of content that's going to come out over the next handful of months. And so we're looking to roll out more regular communication just to ensure that people are informed and they can find ways to engage and be part of the discussion. Josh, just questions?
So sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to flag a member of the public reached out to let me know that the Zoom link on the publicly posted meeting agenda is not working for them. And I verified it is different than the one that we received tonight.
Okay.
So
if
this is, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This is Daniel. I got a couple emails about that. We can chat offline, kind of behind the scenes to get that right. But I think at this point, we should move forward with the meeting and I'll continue to provide the correct link.
Okay, thank you.
Daniel.
I'm
Roger?
wondering if somebody could log into the other Zoom meeting. Is that possible? And redirect people?
I'll try that. Thank you.
Just real quick, Jesse and I had put together a climate change working group. We produced some stuff like the other working groups. Is this different than that? In addition, or maybe you're going to come to this later. I'm not sure. I just want to
thanks, Roger.
understand how the
Great
two all go
question.
together.
Yes, so we'll have a whole agenda item, but this is essentially extra credit in addition to the working group. So we'll talk through. We'll spend a lot of time today just talking through how best to reorient and re-engage the GPAC through the working groups. And so this would be a sort of separate ad hoc focus. Thanks, Roger. Okay, next slide. All right, the big one. So this is something we've communicated, over email. We've sort of signaled that this is going to be another big topic that we're rolling out, and so we're fine-tuning the content here. We've been working with some of our experts. Roger has also been part of that exercise, and so we're getting ready to start. Hopefully, I think the idea is to be in person, have the maps out. It is a lot, so I think we want to put the information out there. We want to have an informed discussion about it, and then allow the community to have an opportunity to ask questions. So we're looking at an open house format. But before we would do that, I believe the next step would be with GPAC, and that is we are planning that to be in person. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more at the later part of this meeting. Next slide. Okay. I think there's been some comments and just general genuine curiosity about what we've been working on, and so I highlighted the housing element that was certified, adopted by City Council, certified by the state back in March, and so that was a big milestone as part of the general plan update effort. We also recently received recognition from YIMBY, so that's an acronym for Yes in My Backyard. It's a advocacy organization throughout the state of California, recognizing our housing element as the best overall in the state. And so that was really exciting to get that recognition. But I think small win, and then really what we need to do is implement, right? How do we achieve those policies and the goals that we identified in the plan? Objective design standards. So this is something that is increasingly important. So we've been spending a lot of time as staff, and so we're shortly going to start engaging with stakeholders in the community, so we can help facilitate a discussion with City Council on what those design standards should look like. Our colleagues with the Public Works Department have been actively working on our update to the active transportation plan. And so there is a workshop with City Council that staff is working diligently on. And so something that we can definitely share out as we get closer, and the staff report is released on that. I'm going to just skip Fairgrounds for a moment. North Station construction, we have, as a city, largely led by our planning division, have been working with SMART and Danco, and so we're on a pretty good path here to start construction, and so we've been working with them on getting that out, and so we should start to have some news to share and have a communications outreach on that as well. Specific plan funding award, so this is related to said North Station, and so this is a grant that we were awarded over $1 million to start a specific plan effort focused on our second station. And so this is really exciting. It dovetails really nicely with the general plan. And I suspect a lot of the work and what we hear throughout this process for the general plan will absolutely carry over as part of that effort. And so we're starting to think about how to roll that out, timing, what makes the most sense. And so lots going on. And then I'll just conclude here with the fairgrounds. A number of you have been involved over the last couple months to really reimagine and really implement the community's vision for how to evolve and not repurpose, but maximize the great community space that the fairgrounds could be. And so sort of a jump off from the healthy democracy effort, City Council direction, and then sort of a nice groundswell of interest from our local partners, nonprofits, our public safety counterparts. We were looking at grant opportunities to help reimagine the fairgrounds and have a component of it be a resiliency center. And so more to come on that, but that's something we're looking at applying for before year's end. And Ron, next slide. And then next steps, I mentioned the introduction to the modeling and the data. What do we do with this new data? How is the city taking this data, applying it to policies that live in the general plan? How do we incorporate it into our zoning code? And so this will be the first introduction to it. So we're really looking forward to it. And we're looking and targeting a September date for that. And so part of that will involve a discussion on flood resilience. So we have this great data. We've spent a lot of time with it. How do we use that data to ensure that the city can be more resilient to our changing climate? And so that is a topic that we are partnering up with our Public Works department, as well as our general plan team here as well. So look forward to that. And then that's really going to be the, there's somewhat of a sequence here. We can cover some of the inputs like sea level rise and flooding, and then that's really going to help us have a more informed discussion on land use alternatives. How do we project what our city looks like over the next 20 years? And so, again, big topics and more to come there. And then the final one here, I think there's been a lot of questions just about the work that the working groups put in. One of those primary deliverables was some working parameters on policy frameworks. And so this is something that's probably, it's not going to be quite sequential, and we're sort of buttoning that up, and that's going to be another big new content that we are looking forward to sharing, and hope that it's reflective of all the work that the working groups have put into them to date. And so more to come, but I wanted to just flag those as key discussion points. And so save the date, we'll share this over email as well, but the next GPAC meeting, September 21st, 6:30 at the community center. And so again, looking forward to it. Thanks for the time, and looking forward to the discussion. And so with that, I will turn it over, I believe, to Ron.
Yeah, we just always like to pause at this point. Thank you, Brian, for those updates, to see if there's any additional questions from GPAC members before we move on to the presentation from Derek. Any questions about Brian's updates? All right, seeing none. At this point, I'm actually going to stop sharing screen, and Derek's going to handle his own slides while he does his presentation. While we're swapping out here, I'll introduce Derek. I think you've seen him at previous meetings, but as a reminder, he's with Strategic Economics, who is on the consulting team, taking the lead on all things economic development and related, including they have quite robust in-house analytical skills, which you'll see on display this evening. And so as part of the scope, the very robust scope, your city was able to engage with these supplemental analyses that aren't commonly done for general plans, but are extremely helpful and informative as a means to inform a variety of policies in the general plan, housing, land use, and others. And so we thought it would be really important and useful to share the findings from these analyses with the GPAC specifically, and have a discussion about what it might mean for the general plan as it evolves. So with that, as a reminder, Derek's going to do his presentation. We'll then pause for clarifying questions. Before we get into discussion, have public comment on this item, then come back to discuss the findings and what to do with the findings for the general plan update. Derek?
Thank you for the introduction, Ron. Can you hear me all right? Great, got a thumbs up. Okay. So before I begin, I just want to say thank you to all the members of the GPAC for your service. I know that this is a labor of love, and it can be a little intense, and but it's also a great way to be contributing to your community, and I'm really grateful for that and for your time today. So I'm going to share the results, well, some background information and results of two analyses that Strategic Economics completed related to the general plan update. You received these reports earlier, but we basically completed two reports that identified barriers and opportunities for the production of higher density, market rate housing development, and I'll define these terms more down the road, and deed restricted affordable housing development projects. And the goal of this work was to inform policy decisions about how Petaluma can accommodate its housing needs in the future. And speaking of those housing needs, the GPAC previously saw the work that was on the housing element that was adopted recently by the state. But basically, the city is under its obligation to meet the regional housing needs allocation goals set forth for it in this upcoming housing element cycle. So those are the RHNA goals, RHNA. And historically, Petaluma has fallen short of its housing production goals for lower income households. The chart on the right, the bottom bars show the 2023 to 2031 goal for this upcoming period. The middle bars in red show the 2015 to 2022 production during this past housing element cycle. And then the yellow bars show the goal that was set forth for that housing element cycle. And what you can see here is that the city performed well in producing moderate income housing and above moderate income housing, basically at the higher income bands, but fell short of its production goals for low and very low income housing. And now the goals are much more aggressive for this upcoming period. So the city has done that work on its housing element, which include identification of opportunity sites for development, including for affordable housing, and also potential policy adjustments. And our work is sort of complementary to that, to look at what are some of the key issues that are posing constraints to housing production. I want to start by defining a number of terms and concepts that were used in this work. So I've already said market rate housing versus deed restricted affordable housing units. Well, what I mean by that is basically market rate housing has no restrictions on prices or rents that can be charged for the tenants in those properties, whereas affordable housing refers to housing units with deed restrictions that limit the occupants to households who earn certain income levels. You can't exceed a certain income level, and the rents have to be based on no more than 30% of that household's income, or the total housing cost, no more than 30%. So what you can see on the right here is the standard breakdown by California Housing and Community Development Department for different income levels. So the AMI refers to area median income. It's based on the county's income level, and then you define a percentage of that for different income bands when you're talking about affordable housing. And I should also note that there's two forms of delivering housing units. And so I'm also going to be referring to market rate development in this presentation. And now a market rate development project can include some deed restricted affordable units. That's called inclusionary housing production. But when I talk about 100% affordable housing developments, that refers to projects in which all or nearly all the units have deed restrictions on them for affordability and are delivered typically by nonprofit housing developers. So I'm going to open with the analysis that focused on the market rate housing development. And this was a financial feasibility analysis which explored barriers to producing that market rate housing. So just to run through a few key concepts here. Basically, a housing development project is considered to be financially feasible when its revenues exceed the cost and investment return that's required for building that project. So a private developer is only going to build a development project when it's going to pencil, as we say, which means it is financially feasible. The market value supports or exceeds the overall cost of getting the project built. A lot of costs and revenues are dynamic, and a lot of these factors are beyond the city's control. But that's why it's important to run an analysis like this to look at, well, how is housing performing, market rate housing performing in a place? What are some barriers to getting it built? This chart on the right shows basically a very, very simplified version of the math that goes into building a market rate housing development project, in which the overall project value has to cover a variety of costs and investment return, and I'll walk through these one at a time. So the biggest component of any development project's costs are hard costs. These are the costs associated with physically building the development project. This includes things like building materials, construction labor, work in grading and paving and landscaping the site, etc. Now, over time, construction material and labor costs have been increasing, especially in the last few years. Some of those cost increases are moderating a little bit right now. I won't get into all the details, but depending on the building type, its height, its size, construction costs can vary. Construction costs per square foot of building. It just depends on how robust the life safety, the fire safety standards need to be based on building height and the ability to exit the building. Now, construction costs tend to be regional. They tend not to vary too much from location to location within a region, because material costs, labor costs don't tend to shift a lot within a region. The next component of a housing development project are soft costs. These are typically the next largest. They include costs associated with design, implementation, and fees for the project. So it's things like architecture and engineering, taxes, insurance, legal and accounting costs, city fees, and then also financing costs from lenders. Land costs are a component, of course, the acquisition of land to build a project. These are much more variable than the other development costs. Land costs vary a lot from not just city to city, but individual sites within a city. They depend on things like the location of the site, its desirability, how much capacity for development exists in the site based on the city's zoning, how much does the city allow to get built on it, what kinds of uses can be built on it. It depends on the local market strength that drives rents or sales prices. What's the infrastructure in the area that serves the site? What's the condition of the land? Does it need remediation for contamination issues or anything like that? So we view in this type of analysis, these feasibility analyses, we look at land costs as being residual. That is, what's left over to pay for the land after you've taken into consideration the project value versus the other costs to deliver the project. And residual land value allows for a comparison between a lot of different product types because it sort of standardizes and equalizes what the how you're looking at the results for the project. And it also points to the fact that sometimes non-residential developers can outbid housing developers for land if a variety of uses are allowed on them. If you have a strong office market, it's possible that an office developer will outbid a housing developer because they can simply afford a higher price for the land. Lastly, there's the concept of investment return. So developers, real estate developers decide to build projects based on the investment return. A project being pursued by a developer will only attract funding if the return is considered to be competitive with alternative investments. And that could be anything. It doesn't have to be real estate investment necessarily. An individual project's required return level is going to vary depending on how risky the project is viewed to be. And so the more certainty there is that a project is likely to pencil, to perform well, the less risk is perceived by developers and the easier it will be to access funding and potentially have lower investment return requirements. Now, I should say this concept is for market rate development housing. A similar situation of costs and market value for a project exists with 100% affordable projects, except the investment return is not driven by market conditions so much, but there might be a fee that is sort of management administration fee that is taken by the developer, the nonprofit developer of the housing. So on the revenue side, we've kind of talked about what's the project value. And so we have to think about market demand and potential revenue of the project. And the key idea here is that market demand was the price that buyers and renters are willing to pay for a project. That price is very local. If a housing unit is located in a place that's very desirable, it has a lot of amenities nearby, it's going to command a higher sales price or rent than something that's very isolated and not well served by other amenities. So demand is ultimately based on many factors, including location, type of product, and other amenities in the area. There are some policies and incentives from the public sector side that can impact a development project's financial feasibility. And so that's where this analysis that we performed can really help to inform potential policy decisions by the city. So there's not a lot of control over things like the costs of construction materials, for example. But some examples of policy levers that the city does have are, let's say, parking ratios. If a development project does not actually need the level of parking required by a minimum parking standard in the city, then it might benefit a developer if the parking ratio is reduced. Now, a developer still wants to have enough parking to market the units, but still, if they have some options and they can provide less parking, that's less of a cost to build that parking. Another example is density controls. How much can be built in a given location based on the allowable unit density or building height, or the overall amount of space that can be built relative to the site, the floor area ratio. There's also incentives the city can provide, such as reducing its fee requirements, which helps to reduce this soft cost category. The city can provide a density bonus, which could potentially increase the market value of the project. Not always, though. It depends on whether or not getting that extra space actually delivers more return. And then the city can also potentially streamline project approvals to reduce financing and holding costs for the project. And so this is just a sample, but there are a variety of different policy mechanisms the city can use to move these market value or some of the cost levers up and down. So with that all in mind, let's move into the results of the analysis for the financial feasibility of market rate housing projects. So we examined those financial feasibility barriers for the higher density market rate housing. Now, the idea here is that higher density housing has pretty rarely been built in Petaluma. Most projects have been shorter. They haven't been especially dense. We analyzed 4 housing development prototypes, which are sort of exemplar projects, illustrative projects that are based on what the types of projects that do get built. And we use those prototypes to look at the financial feasibility of them in Petaluma specifically, how they perform in Petaluma. We examined whether these types of development projects are currently feasible in the city, what drives the costs and revenues for each development prototype, and how city policies can enhance the feasibility, financial feasibility of the prototypes. This chart on the right just demonstrates how rarely taller projects have been built in Petaluma as sort of a stand-in for density as well. But basically what you can see is, and this is just rental projects that currently exist and are tracked by a real estate service called CoStar, so it may not cover everything. But what you're seeing here is that in the 1980s, these rental projects, 3 of them were 1-story, 8 of them were 2-story. And as you move through time, through the decades, you start to see more and more slightly taller buildings, more 3-story buildings in the 2000s and 2010s. And in 2020s, even a 5-story development project. There's a 4-story in the 2000s. But for the most part, most development in the city has historically been 2 or 3 stories. So the development prototypes that we created were a 3-story, a 5-story, and an 8-story product. They're all tested as rentals. And the idea with looking at these higher density products is really they reflect the type of infill development products that can enable the city to accommodate population growth within the urban growth boundary. And I'm not, the idea here is not that all development would be like this, but in places where it might make sense, the question is, how do these perform? And they have these benefits of enabling some growth within the urban growth boundary and enhancing pedestrian and transit trips, placing people potentially close to places with a lot of amenities and good transportation so they don't need to drive as much. Maybe a 2-car household drops to a 1-car household. And so this also has a benefit for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So the prototypes are illustrated here. These are just example pictures. They're not, exactly what the prototypes are, but you see the 3-story multifamily building with tuck-under parking. That's a relatively inexpensive to build, largely wood frame development project, parking tucked underneath. There are 2 versions of an 8-story development project. This is what we call a podium product, meaning that there is a parking podium made of type 1, we call it. It's concrete or steel, in this case concrete parking levels, and then wood frame housing built on top of that. This is a very common development approach in denser sort of infill development settings. And then the last prototype is a 5-story wrap product. Wrap just refers to having the housing, which is wood frame housing, built around a parking garage in the center, which is a concrete parking garage. And often you see these products on slightly larger sites, and often there's a lot of amenities put on top of that central parking garage. So it kind of there's a pool on it or something like that. What the analysis found, the financial feasibility analysis found, is that all of those development prototypes are currently not financially feasible in Petaluma from a developer's perspective. The construction costs to build them, there's a number of drivers for this, a number of reasons this is true. So as I mentioned before, construction costs tend not to vary substantially across the Bay Area. Cost for materials, the cost for labor, there's not huge differences from one part of the Bay Area to another. And then on top of that, there have been worsening project financing challenges. It's unclear what interest rates are or should be. There's been a lot of changes lately. And so a lot of the investment and capital markets have sort of frozen up for project investment. On top of this, you have rents and sales prices that can be achieved in Petaluma, that people are willing to pay in Petaluma, are lower than in many other Bay Area locations. To some extent, you're competing against, from a developer's perspective, you're competing against some of the sort of core Bay Area locations. There's a number of different development opportunities, and Petaluma tends to command, in the North Bay in general, the Sonoma County in general, tends to command lower rents and sales prices. And then, so there need to be additional measures to address this cost and revenue challenge for development. We found that the 5-story and 8-story prototypes are especially unlikely to become financially feasible in the immediate future. That's not to say they never will be. A lot of conditions change over time, but they are sort of farthest off from becoming financially feasible. I also always want to caution with this kind of analysis, some real world development projects that may still proceed due to unique factors. Like if somebody has owned land for a long time and has very low holding costs, it's possible they could still build a 3-story project, let's say. The chart on the right illustrates the results. It's a lot to absorb, but basically the dashed line is the typical land sale price cost that's expected in Petaluma. So that's the threshold, the hurdle you need to achieve with this greenish bar, the residual land value. So the other bars are just project value versus development costs. But the key one to focus on here is the residual land value. That's that amount left over to pay for land in each of these development prototypes after you account for revenues and costs, or project value and costs. And it's all negative for these prototypes. We examined some illustrative city actions that could potentially impact this feasibility gap. Total development costs for these prototypes must be reduced 30 to 43% if you hold rents constant. So we analyzed, well, what's the impact of reducing the city's municipal fees? What's the impact of reducing the city's inclusionary affordable housing requirements, or their fees that can be paid in lieu of that? And what are the impacts of reducing the city's parking requirements? Ultimately, we found that about, like it says at the top, you could kind of have the feasibility gap here. The chart on the right shows as you add in these things to help it improve feasibility, what's the impact on the residual land value? You get the picture improves, but you're still not at that black bar that's shown. That's the threshold for achieving feasibility. And I also always want to point out, changes to city policies that affect housing feasibility must consider other critical policy goals and priorities. Impact fees, pay for actual infrastructure needs in the city, the inclusionary housing requirements, ensure that you get mixed income housing. So there's always trade-offs to consider in all these decisions. Additional policy options to improve financial feasibility of these development projects include accommodating new and emerging construction techniques, such as mass timber, which is essentially a wood framing technique that can potentially reduce the cost per square foot of housing while still going taller than you can today, and some of the less expensive development materials. Also potentially removing ground floor retail requirements where appropriate in order to save on the cost of building out the retail, which often does not provide return based on its rents. Another option is providing greater certainty and speed for approving development projects. We heard this a lot from developers in the city, that there's some challenges in navigating the processes at the city side, and that's improving. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then investing in district amenities and desirability to help enhance desirability of places in Petaluma and boost those achievable rents and sales prices. So with all that said, ultimately at the end of the day, there will need to be some bigger picture changes in the development costs, and also increases in local achievable rents and sales prices. So the city can help with this process, but ultimately at the end of the day, there has to be some bigger shifts as well, which could happen over time. And just to illustrate this point, on the right here, there's a chart that shows the overall citywide average asking rent for housing units in Petaluma, Santa Rosa, Oakland, and San Francisco. And you can really see here how much higher San Francisco is. It's a whole other category of its own. Oakland citywide is also, of course, much higher. And then within Oakland, there are a number of different submarkets. So developers are always thinking about this picture of, what are the rents and what do they have to consider when they're putting forward a development project. Moving into the 100% affordable housing development projects and that affordable housing finance analysis that we performed. So when we talk about 100% affordable housing development projects pursued typically by nonprofit housing developers, these require subsidy because the market value of the project, supported by the reduced rents for the households in these development projects, is going to be lower. And so there's a funding gap challenge for affordable housing projects. These projects have rents and sales prices that are regulated to below market rates. Usually, these projects might target lower income levels than an inclusionary housing policy for market rate projects. So they might target extremely low, very low, and low income households. And the deeper the affordability level, the larger the funding gap for these projects. So the benefits of 100% affordable housing are that the projects leverage many funding sources. The challenges are that they have limited or competitive resources for filling that funding gap. They're public resources, and these projects typically do not provide housing options for moderate income households, although it's possible in a sort of a mixed income affordable housing project. So there's a variety of sources of subsidies for development financing for these affordable projects. Affordable housing developers, such as ALLI on the GPAC, have to assemble a capital stack of federal, state, and local sources. This capital stack just refers to the mix of funding sources for the project. And here on this bar chart on the right, you see a stack of typical funding sources for affordable housing projects in Petaluma, 2020 to 2021. These are just 2 projects, but this is typical. Federal sources, which are low-income housing tax credits, are usually the largest portion of this stack. You have state sources, and they also have the local sources, which consists in this case of city and county funding. Now, city contributions help projects compete for development interest and outside funding because they provide essentially a form of matching funds for other sources. Now, the local funding sources in Petaluma are relatively limited. Examples of city sources that provide for affordable housing funding include commercial linkage fees, which are applied to non-residential development projects like offices. You have housing in lieu fees, which are paid in lieu of providing inclusionary affordable units in market rate housing projects. And there's also impact fee waivers, which are new this year, in which the city is providing waivers to 100% affordable projects from its impact fees, which pay for infrastructure needs and facilities needs. So when you look at affordable housing development in the county, typical project costs are $500,000 to $700,000 per unit. Sometimes they're higher than this range, but that's kind of typical in what the data that we've examined. Petaluma and Sonoma County together contribute about 8% of project costs in recent development projects. This predates the city's fee waiver policy, and so the amount might be higher now with the fee waiver policy, but that's what we saw in the projects we reviewed. Just for a point of comparison, honestly, because we had the data from prior projects, we looked at San Francisco and Santa Clara counties and found that the local funding contributed 30% to 37% of project costs. They're very different contexts. They're urban, well-resourced counties, but still, this is a big difference, 8% local contribution versus 30% or 37% contribution. So our recommended city actions to expand funding, or potential city actions to expand funding for 100% affordable projects, include potentially allocating more general fund revenue. This is the city's unrestricted operating fund. Potentially more of that revenue could go towards affordable housing production. There's the option of voter approved tax measures, such as a bond measure with parcel taxes, or as a charter city, the city can potentially increase its property transfer tax and dedicate that revenue to affordable housing, for example. Another option is providing greater flexibility for market rate housing developers to pay in lieu fees, which provides funding for those more deeply affordable housing projects, but has the downside of now you don't get the on-site inclusionary affordable housing in the market rate projects, so you don't get those mixed income projects. There's trade-offs to all of this. Another option is to incentivize market rate housing developers to provide greater in lieu fees, such as providing some sort of density bonus, or maybe even an impact fee waiver for them if they provide you can provide incentives for in lieu fees. And then lastly, potentially targeting funding to projects that are more competitive for outside funding, such as the projects that are located in high resource areas. So every funding source has a scoring system based on its attributes, its location, and the big push right now from Housing and Community Development, from the Tax Credit Allocation Committee at the state, is to emphasize development of affordable housing projects in high resource areas. And I'm sure you heard a lot about this during the housing element. Other options to reduce barriers to affordable housing unit development. So now I'm speaking more broadly. This is just how do you get affordable housing units through not necessarily just 100% affordable housing development projects. Well, there's reducing cost barriers. I mentioned earlier the idea of revisiting ground floor retail requirements. The city can also potentially waive impact fees for market rate development projects that provide higher levels of inclusionary units. And then there's the possibility of enhancing the certainty and timeliness of approvals processes through things like specific plans, objective design standards, internal city staff process improvements, and expanding overall staff capacity. And then I didn't really speak about this much, but there's also some options for enhancing accessory dwelling units. These are those granny flats, the basement units, the backyard units. They are considered to be sort of an affordable by design product. They don't have price and rent restrictions, but they're small and they tend to be less costly and maybe affordable to moderate income households. And the city is taking efforts right now to support production of those ADUs through its ongoing partnerships with the Napa Sonoma ADU Center. I'm going to close on a very cheerful and positive note about recent city actions. So the city is already starting to implement many of the changes and recommendations of this work. I think a lot of these issues have been to varying extents recognized for some time, and the housing element also provides some guidance on this. And so the city has recently adopted and implemented those impact fee waivers that I mentioned for 100% affordable projects that came into effect this year. And the city is, as Brian mentioned earlier, preparing to develop this North Petaluma Station specific plan. Hopefully I got the name quite right. And there has been a new city internal reorganization, creating the community development department reorganization and the creation of a departmental strategic plan, which can help with that development processing actions. And the city has added 2 staff positions in the housing department. So great progress is being made. I want to recognize that. And so with that, I'm going to close. And I don't know if Ron, you want to take the questions or if I should lead this.
I'll help moderate. Just a reminder to GPAC members and the public, we'll first see if any GPAC members have any questions about the material that Derek presented. Let's hold discussion for the time being, just any clarifying questions you may have. Because then we want to first go to public comment before we return to GPAC discussion. We do that so that the GPAC discussion can be informed by what we hear from the public. So first, just any clarifying questions before we go to public comment. I see Bill and then Allie.
Should I go?
Please, thank you.
Great. Just a couple questions. Thanks for the analysis. Kind of a downer, really, to find out that none of these housing types will pencil. But I imagine I have 2 questions. One is, I imagine there's a corresponding analysis for sale product for urban housing like condos and townhomes. And I just wonder, are the findings generally the same, that we can't generate the revenues to make those feasible? So that's question 1. And question 2, the 2-parter, is did we identify any housing types, especially urban housing types, that would be feasible in Petaluma for rentals? So that's my 2-part question. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for that. So this analysis, we did not perform a detailed financial feasibility analysis for ownership housing product types like condos and townhomes. I can say that working in a variety of different market contexts in the Bay Area recently, it's not unusual for townhomes to perform fairly well right now, especially in markets kind of similar to Petaluma, just because it's a relatively inexpensive to build product type. And it commands a fairly high sales price in most situations. It tends to perform fairly well. Condos are challenging to deliver throughout most Bay Area communities, almost universally right now. But we didn't do the actual analysis specifically for Petaluma on that. I think that the townhomes can certainly be a great contributor to a denser walkable urban fabric. But part of our work was more focused on even higher density kinds of development projects, because you don't often get outside of 30 dwelling units per acre with townhomes. And then on the question about identifying housing types that do work in Petaluma, again, the emphasis was more on the higher density housing product types. So we didn't get into a whole lot of depth on that, but I would say, as we saw in the results, the 3-story development prototype, that product was closest to being financially feasible. And I think it's someone that's most likely to maybe find the right combination of actual on the ground conditions, in which, let's say it's a longtime property owner, a property owner that has lower costs or has access to different capital sources or has different thresholds of return. Then maybe the 3-story is probably closest to being financially feasible. But this is honestly a little speculative.
Thanks, Derek. I see Ali's hand and then Sharon. And just quickly before you go, Ali, I see Shakti, your hand is raised. I believe you're a member of the public. We're going to have public comment immediately after these questions from the GPAC. So, so hold your comment or question. There'll be public comment shortly. Ali?
Thank you. And thanks, Derek, for these analyses. I think the reports were really well done and really well written and easy to follow. So thank you. Just one question on the policy about recommendation about potentially waiving fees for additional in lieu units for market rate development. Would that trigger prevailing wage for those market rate developers?
I honestly I don't know the answer to this question. And so I think that's something that we would have to follow up on. I will correct one thing I said. I started going on the path of suggesting waiving fees for the in lieu fees. It was a little more targeted to the idea of potentially developers providing more on-site inclusionary units. But either way, you could use it as an incentive either way. But as far as whether it triggers prevailing wage, that's something I could research.
Thanks, Derek. Sharon?
There we go. Thank you very much for the analysis, Derek. It is a little depressing, I have to say. It doesn't get us where we need to be. So I had questions along those lines. Was there analysis completed to determine if the recommended policy changes would enable the projects to pencil? I mean, did we ever get to go with the recommended changes?
Yes, yeah, thank you. So there was one, I'll share my screen when I pull this up. So there was the one sort of, I referred to as an illustrative analysis in which we looked at these just sort of examples of, well, what happens if you reduce the municipal fees? What happens if you reduce the inclusionary requirements and reduce the parking requirements? And so we didn't test all of the different recommendations in this way. Some of them are also harder to capture in a financial analysis. But this is where we saw that these still don't bring these projects to the level of financial feasibility, but they do help tremendously. They do sort of have this financial feasibility gap that we saw in their results. Okay,
and then I had two other quick questions. Were there nearby cities considered in the analysis? And I asked this question, it's kind of a leading question because I spend a fair amount of time in Santa Rosa, and they have many multi-story apartment complexes going up. And I have a hard time understanding how they can do this in Santa Rosa where the rents are lower than they are in Petaluma, and have those projects pencil where they don't in Petaluma. So I'm just kind of curious if we looked at area cities.
We did look around to see where there were taller, higher density projects being built, and Santa Rosa, I believe, even has an 8-story project going up. But if memory serves, it might be an affordable project. So even in Santa Rosa, we didn't see a whole lot of market rate, higher density projects being built. But that I don't know off the top of my head if that's comprehensively true. But from our scans, yeah, we didn't see a whole lot of that happening.
Yeah, I would be really curious about that because it seems like they are building quite a lot, and like you say, I don't know if they're market rate or affordable, so that would any determination would vary based on that information. I also read the reports before you made the presentation. The presentation was really well thought out. Thank you. But then the report, you also suggested a city land bank as an option for affordable housing to reduce some of the stress on those projects. Can you describe that in a little bit more detail? What is a city land bank? It wasn't defined in the report, and I'm just curious. I have some assumptions, but I want to make sure I understand.
Sure. I mean, essentially, there would have to be a land acquisition mechanism established in the city to start acquiring land, or holding the city's land in order to have affordable housing development on it in the future. And it essentially removes the land acquisition costs for these future development projects. And then it's also possible in using the land bank to come up with different sort of structures and approaches for how you deliver the housing, and so it could potentially be on a long-term ground lease in which the city holds the land in the land bank permanently, and has control over, what gets built and what the rents are, and eventually the project might, return back to the city after a period of time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
I see your hand, Heather. Do you have a clarifying?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to something that Sharon brought up. So the city of Santa Rosa was having a very hard time. They would entitle those projects and they weren't getting built. And that was the case for quite a while. I know they were doing quite a few things like, and don't hold me to the exact numbers, but things like above the 4 stories, no impact fees, or even for market rate, or things like a larger project being able to be processed as an administrative project. So not going through the public hearings to increase the processing time and the costs associated with that. I would be happy to check in with colleagues in Santa Rosa to kind of get an update. It's been a little while since I chatted with them, but I do also notice, I live in Santa Rosa, and so I do notice that all of a sudden there's a number of them that are actually under construction and going up in Santa Rosa. So I'd be happy to follow up on that and get some information from our colleagues with Santa Rosa on some of the more recent things they've done.
Yeah, that would be great. It's just, I know this isn't the comment area, but it would be great to understand if there are things we can learn from area communities, since it sounds like just making little tweaks around the edges isn't going to get us where we need to be. Thank you.
I would also just add on to that we've done financial feasibility analyses in communities, and they show things are just totally infeasible. But then we do see sometimes, but basically this prototype is getting built, and it's often because it turns out, maybe that project has been in the works for a really long time. The land was purchased a long time ago, and for that developer, it was just, they were able to move forward now. And so we're drawing these broad lessons and trying to make some policy recommendations out of this analysis, but it won't apply to every circumstance and every developer.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon, Heather, Derek. I see Mary's hand raised, and again, Shakti will come to public comment in just a moment. Mary?
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the impact fee waiver for 100% affordable. Just if you happen to know the history on that, like, were we not getting enough applications because we have these state laws that allow 100% affordable to come in with and build by right, and I would think that would be enough incentive. So I was just wondering what was the trigger to, or what pushed it to completely waive the impact fee. I mean, the 100%, it's a complete waiver, like 100% waiver is what I'm hearing.
Want me to take that one?
Yes, I'm going to defer to you, Heather.
Sure. So Mary, what we were hearing repeatedly from our affordable housing development partners was the impact fees were just, kind of another gut punch, right? So trying to make it work, trying to go after so many sources, and the amount that the city's impact fees added was millions of dollars for an affordable housing project. And so we have been looking as a city for every possible way we can incentivize affordable housing, right? So even if the ministerial review through state law requirements like SB 35 or AB 2162, yes, that was speeding up the review process or cutting costs with the review process, but it still was a big cost. So what we looked at, and I'm going to be nitpicky about language, it's not a fee waiver. It is a fee exemption. So what we did was we created an exemption to specific impact fees for projects, certain projects, and they're affordable projects. And I'm gonna not have the exact language, but that have been supported or partially funded or a partnership with the city, but 100% affordable. And it waives the city facilities, the traffic, the park acquisition, park development, open space acquisition. It does not waive the wastewater and water capacity fees, because those are, you need that to supply the water and the wastewater. So it was all the ones. It doesn't waive the school fees, because those aren't our fees, but it waived all the ones we could. But I want to be really clear, it is not a waiver for the inclusionary. So if a market rate developer comes in and they've got to have their 15% affordable unit, it does not, that fee exemption doesn't apply to the affordable units of a market rate project. It's for affordable housing projects.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, it's, we're talking millions of dollars. And so, obviously the projects cost much more. And so I think the impetus really was, how do we help support and be creative? And so not just from a fee exemption perspective, but we are seeing some successful projects. And, this has essentially been implemented for, just 8 months. I think it happened right before I started. And so there have been projects that have utilized this. And there's been an added benefit of outside source, outside financing, considering it as a local match. And so, again, that helps with that capital stack that Derek was presenting on. So we're, maybe it's one strategy. We have a number of, there's sort of this clear objective on how do we produce and incentivize more and help reach our goals and, get us the housing that we need for our community. And so that's part of what we're doing as part of implementing the housing element. So, a lot of really great recommendations there. And so more to come, but, things that we're looking at implementing as well.
Thank you, Brian and Heather. Bill Wolpert.
Thank you, Ron. I guess another quick two-part question. One is, in the 4 scenarios that didn't pencil out, I wasn't clear, other than the fact that they were trying to be affordable housing, what income level were they shooting for? Was it anything that qualified as affordable? And my second question is, it seems like the design constraints or the context by which these potential projects were imagined were of the greater Bay Area, not Petaluma. I'm really surprised to see considerations of 8-story buildings when they completely exceed anything that's allowed by our zoning. We have a specific plan for our downtown core under the SMART code that allows buildings up to 6 stories. And as you mentioned, we haven't seen any of those developed. And especially with the downtown core, the proximity to the SMART station, but it's also within a historic district. I think 8-story buildings are completely out of context. So I'm just curious on, was that even a consideration in these scenarios, or this just kind of, blue sky pencil pushing and this doesn't work? I was just really surprised that, I don't know, by the context surprised me.
Sure. So I'll take those one at a time. So on I may not have been clear. So the prototypes that we looked at and the financial feasibility analysis that we performed, that was all for market rate development projects. So we had 2 different sets of analyses, and this presentation, led with the market rate financial feasibility analysis, and then led to more of the policy analysis around affordable housing finance. And maybe that line wasn't so clear. So that was all testing market rate development projects. And if they were affordable development projects, then it would be a very different approach to how that would have been funded via a variety of outside subsidy sources for its development. On the design of the prototypes that were examined, you're correct. There is no place in the city right now that allows an 8-story development project. And this is also not intended to be an exercise that assumes that's going to happen. And we did also have the 3-story and the 5-story development projects, which can be built in Petaluma under its existing regulations. The 8-story was sort of viewed as being let's take the sort of tallest yet still closest in many ways to being feasible, because once you get above 8 stories, your construction technique changes, your cost per square foot goes up quite a bit, and then it becomes much more challenging to get anything built. Even in really strong market locations, 8 stories is a cutoff before you then start having to look at some real high-rise types of buildings. And so the goal was basically to test that swinging for the fences type of scenario with the 8-story development project, I'd say.
Yeah, and thanks, Jack. Bill, the other thing, I think just it's illustrative, right? It's not to say, we want to explore something above and beyond. I do think it's for the comparison, right? It's a pure comparison of, as Derek pointed out, there's the ability to do 3 and 5. There's challenges to that. I think there's a natural response from many people to say, okay, well, same amount of land, how do we increase the land value? And so what does it look like? And so to me, like what stood out is it's not as simple as just saying, if you build taller, that's going to solve the financial component, right? There's still, it's not that black and white. It's not that simple. And so to me, it was just purely a comparison of what may happen, what, may be a product in other parts of the Bay Area that at the end of the day, we're sort of competing in a joint labor market. And those are projects we see in other parts of the Bay Area, right? And so those are, in many ways seen as sort of competition when it comes to the labor pool.
Can I also add really quickly, Bill, is some of the not affordable housing, some of the market rate projects that have come through, there's been discussion like at the council or the planning commission in an effort to try to get more housing. Well, can't you add another story? Can't you go taller? And what we were hearing from developers is no, it doesn't pencil. But we also wanted to kind of have an objective analysis of that, because sometimes when a developer said it doesn't pencil, you're like, well, what if this, or why not that, or right? So we saw this also as an opportunity to say, okay, well, is it true that going taller, like Brian was saying, doesn't change the dynamic? Because in your head, you're thinking more units, then it'll pencil. So I think it was not an effort to say, yeah, let's put 8 stories all over, but it was an effort to say, if it went taller, would that address some of the market challenges that we're hearing anecdotally from applicants? We don't require, performas for applicants and stuff. Isn't something that's part of the required submittals. So we don't often have the teeth to say, we'll prove it. So this was our opportunity to say, well, let's throw in 2 extra stories, and does that change the dynamic? And what we are seeing is no, it doesn't seem like it really does in this case. So,
well, I mean that's the takeaway I'm getting, and I'm stunned that market rate housing doesn't even pencil out. That's really a shocking discovery for me anyway. Affordable housing is one thing when you're dealing with subsidies, but when market rate housing doesn't pencil out at 8 stories, I'm stunned.
And I'll say, conditions do change over time. So that's not to say that this is going to be true necessarily 5 years from now, but one way or another, we do see it's the one that's farthest off.
Thank you all. Josh?
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking a bit about the contrast in local funding to support projects. So there was that figure of like, okay, 8%, Petaluma, Sonoma County versus 37, and granted much more urban areas that are better resourced. This may be a little bit into the weeds, so please forgive me if this is like maybe not the right form to ask this particular question, but I'm thinking about, we have this whole discussion going on about the overlay around downtown, and I'm wondering if there are ways to, you mentioned like tax measures, for instance, as a way to create more funding for these projects. I'm wondering if there are mechanisms that maybe you've seen in other areas where incremental tax from greater infill in an area, like in this overlay, should this come to pass, could that be earmarked for that kind of thing? Like for whether that be deed restricted affordable housing or just to support projects more generally. Is that a done thing? Does that exist?
The sort of purest form of what you just described were redevelopment agencies in California. It was a whole system of capturing tax increments. So basically the capturing and reinvesting the increase in the property tax base within a given area. That went away several years ago. The redevelopment agencies were dissolved, and no replacement tool of that nature has quite matched the way it worked for redevelopment agencies. There are some possibilities of using some of the sort of tax increment replacement measures like enhanced infrastructure financing districts. They have a similar mechanism in them, but they're not the resources that are used for affordable housing out of those newer tools. They generate very little revenue, specifically for affordable housing. Typically, they're not usually used that way, and they also don't capture nearly as much revenue in the first place, because the redevelopment agencies, the criticism of them is that they sort of took money away from all the taxing entities for reinvestment in a given location. Whereas these newer mechanisms, basically every taxing entity needs to opt into it. So unless you can get cooperation from the county or school district or whatever it might be, then the revenue is kind of limited to the city, and it's just sort of in many ways similar to the city just paying itself with that revenue. So there are some barriers. The biggest version of that mechanism doesn't exist anymore. So there are some challenges with this now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see any additional hands. So I think we'll shift at this point, Daniel, to public comment, and then GPAC will come back to further discussion about kind of what to do with this information to inform the general plan update.
Great. Thank you, Ron. So at this time, we'll go ahead and reopen public comment. I see we have at least one hand raised. So once again, if you're a member of the public and you'd like to speak, please utilize the raise hand feature. I'll go ahead and call on you. I'll share my screen. When the timer starts, you'll have 3 minutes for your comments. And please just remember to keep everything civil, avoid any obscene language. With that, I see at least one hand. So Shakti, I hope I have that right. I will go ahead and share my screen, and we'll move forward with general public comment. Let's see. Okay, so you should have the ability to unmute yourself. Whenever you're ready, we'll start the timer and the floor will be yours. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. Please explore the adjusting impacts and promoting affordable building techniques like modular buildings. No to the 5 8-story buildings. I see this presentation is being made alongside the downtown overlay as city staff and our local urbanistas who live in single family homes are trying to push this change. You're going to ruin the character of this town. Balancing density with quality of life should be our goal. And if we add density, it should be gentle density, like duplexes and quadplexes and ADUs. Don't destroy the design and character of this town. I've lived here all my life. Not every city has to grow infinitely. So it's about sustainability, and it's about homeostasis and environment, not out of control development. So also, it doesn't feel right to have this discussion excluding the public. This topic is not heavily publicized, and the Zoom link for this meeting didn't even work. And I think many citizens would be shocked by this discussion if they knew that this was happening. And bringing this into the public, I mean, we need banners like they do for all the different things on Kentucky Street, D Street. Engagement on this issue needs to happen, and not canceling meetings and keeping people out of this conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks for your comment. We'll go ahead and restart the timer. Looks like Dwayne has his hand up. So I'll go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourself, and when you're ready, the floor will be yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank everybody for being here and for putting in their time. I don't see it. There's any way that the real problem, the wages, the housing cost imbalance, is going to be solved at the local level. Certainly not by taxing the middle class to pay for housing for the lower class. There's just no discussion of the real cause of the problem, and to get it any resolution. The two minor things I'd like to bring up, though, that is, one is discussion of mobile homes. And I didn't hear anything about mobile homes. The people who live in mobile homes deserve to have co-ops or condos arrangements so that they're not on land owned by speculators, that they're able to, as a co-op, own the property. And second, you mentioned San Francisco and seem to be successful. And I would like to know the sources of funds that San Francisco is able to get to deal with their problem, that maybe we should be paying more attention to as to how we get some of those funds. And I assume that I shouldn't be referring to the fact that they loot our gas tax in order to use the money in San Francisco however they like. What else is needed to be said? We need to be talking about the long-term effect of their floods, and we'll be discussing that in a future meeting, and how that's going to affect especially the lower class people, because that's generally where we put lower class people, is in the way of floods and danger. So we'll discuss that in another meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dwayne. And next up, Susan, the floor is yours when you're ready. We'll start the timer. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for responding to my emails in the beginning of the meeting. I want to lift up and really agree with the comments before me that Shakti made and Dwayne made. They were very thoughtful and relevant comments for our city and community here in Petaluma. I think it would have been very helpful, even though this appears to be kind of a high-level discussion, would have been practical and helpful for many of us for you to have brought in the information that was mentioned earlier, the questions that were raised about Santa Rosa. Why don't we know what they're doing, what their zoning codes are, how they're able to do what they're doing, where they're doing it, how successful they've been? Santa Rosa and perhaps at least one other city in Sonoma County as case studies to then compare to how we in Petaluma are approaching both market rate and affordable housing. I just think it would have been most helpful to have, and we should know that information. So anyway, I just felt a little uncomfortable about that. And I also want to acknowledge Joshua Simmons, your GPAC member, as someone who is responsive, responsible, intelligent, thoughtful, and a person of integrity. I just feel he's a really great representative on your committee, and I appreciate him so much. And I wish that the committee members that have been appointed to this committee would attend the meetings. It's disheartening for those of us who have really in-depth experience in certain areas and to be basically tossed off the list and misrepresented as considerations were given for appointments. So, and again, thank you, Daniel, for your responsiveness tonight. And you didn't have general public comment because where were the members of the public? We couldn't get in. The agenda link, the Zoom link was wrong on the published agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And sincere apologies for if there was a link that was incorrect in any of the agenda items. We'll certainly huddle and make sure that doesn't happen again. So with that, I don't see any more hands raised. I'll turn it back over to you, Ron, and we'll close general public comment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, members of the public. So we wanted to hold a little agenda time tonight for broader discussion about the takeaways and some of the recommendations from the two reports that Derek profiled. There's clear connections to the housing element. I took the time to kind of compare some of the recommendations from the reports with the housing element, and kind of as the YIMBY law folks confirmed, the city already is being extremely progressive in many respects in implementing many of the recommendations that the reports recommend through its housing element and other means. But as we look forward in the planning process to policy frameworks specific to a broad range of topics that the GP will address, and probably more specifically the future land use and settlement patterns for Petaluma, I'm curious about any thoughts GPAC members have about how the findings from this analysis and some of the recommendations can inform the general plan update moving forward. Mary?
Is this time to talk? Is that what you meant?
Yes, it's the time for GPAC discussion about the reports. We finished clarifying questions, got public comments, and now it's time for discussion. Yes.
I really liked the presentation and I got a lot out of it. I would have answered the question about Santa Rosa as being probably all under SB 35 or something that's built by right, but Heather will confirm. Just having known what's been going on in Santa Rosa, that was an answer to Susan's comment. I think this feasibility gap is really interesting, and the combination of reducing impact fees, not forcing retail, or as we've done in the past, consideration for a flex space on the ground floor, which can be adapted to housing or some other use that makes sense as things change, as they always do. The comment about the slow approval process, which it sounds like it's already being addressed. The one that really struck me, and this is kind of something I think that the general plan can spend more time on, is this idea of investing in town amenities. Like the idea that we can't get, and we need all types of housing. Obviously, we have the market rate housing is doing better, but as we're working on and the impact fee exemption, great move. We'll see improvement there. But I'm interested in investing in the town's amenity, and primarily the open space that we have as our largest natural resource that is unique, and it makes Petaluma a desirable place to be. But there's so many things as you look at the town, and we all adapt to our surroundings and stop noticing things that are basically falling apart. You could imagine people coming in and saying, well, I'm not so sure about this. So I think the feasibility gap comments were right on, and maybe we can take on some of these ideas of how to invest in our town's amenities. The And lastly, the land banks. Thank you for bringing that up earlier, Sharon. We have city-owned property, and there's places that make sense for housing, affordable housing, and that don't make as much sense for civic buildings. And I'm looking forward to sinking into that when we get into the land use portion. And I'd love to hear other people's opinions on this. Any of it.
Thank you, Mary. Sharon, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, so one of the, I've been ruminating on the reports prior to the meeting, and what I'm just struck by is it doesn't look like we can get there from here. I mean, in terms of meeting our RHNA targets, and I'd like to understand if that's an accurate understanding, a reading of the reports, and if so, then we have to become much more radical in what we're looking at in terms of solutions. So we're kind of picking at things, but we're not really thinking wholesale. How can we do things differently? So the land bank to me was a really interesting idea. I think it also, if we're talking about transferring limited general funds, general fund monies to affordable housing, then what are we doing to bolster general fund monies? And this is where big projects like the hotel downtown come in with, massive transient occupancy taxes and other revenues that are brought into the city. Really unpopular ideas, but still taken in their whole. Everything's connected. So it just seems that we're just dancing around the edges of the solutions that will really get us to the RHNA targets. And maybe I'm reading this incorrectly, and there's another way to get there from here. I would actually love to hear from the planning team about that. Reading this report, do you still think we can build, 4 times what we've built in the last housing cycle? So that's a rambling concern. The other thing I wanted to make, point I wanted to make, and this is borders on the what's the word I'm looking for? I'll be burned as a heretic for this, but we have a huge property in the middle of town that is owned by the city. It's called the Fairgrounds. So we either need to get serious about making way for affordable housing in other places, or we're going to be, push come to shove, we're going to be offering up that land for affordable housing. I just don't see how we get there from here. So I'd love to hear from bigger thinkers than me on this one. Thanks.
Well, Sharon, I definitely don't shortchange yourself. I would, just from the short time that we've spent here, I mean, I definitely consider you a big time thinker. So all good ideas. I think, ultimately it's, as one of the public commenters mentioned, the greater discussion around general plan and how do we build and how do we be responsive to the need for housing, how do we be responsive to the climate emergency, with the context of how we want to grow and evolve as a city. All of that is happening, right? It's happening tonight as we have this informed discussion. And so every one of these voices are critical to that, I think. And to just to close, I mean, short response, I 100% genuinely believe and know that we will meet those RHNA numbers. It's just for starters, with the housing element, that was informed by a lot of really good thinking that came out of the community. It provides a nice roadmap, right? The hard work is ahead of us. There's a number of policies and programs that we would have committed to first up is before the end of the calendar year next year. So, we're starting to move on that stuff, and it's going to take a number of different approaches and strategies, but at the end of it, I'm quite confident that we'll get there.
Can I also add to that, Brian, that, one thing I want to remind people about is we have a number of affordable housing projects that are in the pipeline. So that's a positive, right? We have the Mid-Penn project that is currently under construction. We have, we just finished the Homekey project at the America's Best Value. Was that? Yeah, okay. I see Josh nodding at me. We have the Burbank project on Petaluma Boulevard South that is getting ready to pull permits. We have the Danko project that we're trying to stay really engaged and creative, and we're still very positive about that coming to fruition. So when you think about our RHNA and our sixth cycle, we have a number of 100% affordable projects that have already gone through the pipeline, gotten their approvals, and hopefully those are going to start coming online. So our focus has very much been with those projects. We've been trying to be flexible and creative and pivot and understand we're not generating a lot of money through housing in lieu fees, because we changed our in lieu regulations so that we don't allow people to fee out anymore. So that while that's getting, those funds aren't generating as much, that's why we were looking at things like the fee exemptions, because we have to continue to get creative. And we are, to Mary's point, exploring ideas around city-owned properties, and how do we look at those differently, and how do we leverage those? So I just want to there's things about, and I know Derek is such a pleasant human being and he had to deliver such somber news, but we are really committed and, kind of trying not to leave any stone unturned to come up with new ideas. And that's what this is so exciting about this process that we're undertaking. And that's why the hard work of our housing element recognized for, Petaluma's housing element has a lot of great stuff in it. Those are all the things to kind of keep us energized and keep us working towards what we're doing. The other thing that we called for in our housing element that I think could have a good positive effect on housing is, our code and our fees, they don't regulate by size of housing units. So for instance, a 2,000 square foot single family home versus a tiny home, they're both a single family detached. You know what I mean? So those are other things that we can be looking at our codes. So I just want to pump you up a little bit. We're all in this and we're all looking for those great ideas, and we're trying to think big and think different and come up with the right solutions for Petaluma and as part of this general plan.
Thank you, Heather.
Yes, thank you, Heather and Brian. I see several hands raised, so please be cognizant of that. You have many of your fellow GPAC members that would like to speak, so please keep your comments concise if you could. Thank you. Bill.
Yes, tagging on to what my heretic friend mentioned a few minutes ago. I was just kind of free thinking about other communities that have a lot of residential projects under construction, and Healdsburg came to mind, and very expensive, well over $1 million a unit, from what I understand, at the old lumberyard site. And I know we have opposition in town for this hotel, and with comments like it's too expensive. It's not something I could afford to stay there. We don't want to be Healdsburg. We don't want to be Napa. But it's those kinds of projects that bring the money into town, that provides the taxes that allows us to pay for affordable housing. And so I would really like to see us try to help some of those projects come to fruition so that we can afford to do more affordable housing. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Bill Wolpert. And now Bill Reinhardt.
Sorry about that. Couldn't find the mute button. I wanted to thank Heather for a little bit of uplifting. That was good news. Trying to make sense of the purpose of the reports and the findings. And my takeaways, I generally agree with the recommendations for letting go of ground floor retail in certain locations, and I guess fee waivers in places. But I wonder what's the real takeaway from this? The fact that rental housing is not feasible in Petaluma, and so I'm wondering, should we be looking towards, in order to get the urban housing, the density downtown that we want, and also to get affordable housing, perhaps we should be looking at for sale, and encouraging the 3 to 5 story for sale townhome condo type projects, and figure out how to make those, whether it's new building type or whatever, figure out how to make those a good model for Petaluma, and encourage that and make it work, and find the building types that do work. And I think this is good for us to be having now, because I think we've been going down this road of looking at the overlay and everything about density and everything. But if this stuff doesn't pencil out and rental housing is not affordable or feasible, we need to somehow figure out how to bridge that gap. So one thing I think of, the reason I was getting at for sale housing is that another factor was pointed out is that the in lieu fees are cheaper than actually providing units. So that tells me that the in lieu fees are maybe not commensurate with the cost of the affordable housing. Maybe what we need to do is focus on building for sale houses or homes, and then have in lieu fees that are commensurate with the rates, the appropriate rates, in order to allow the city to collect those fees and then provide a greater contribution. The 8%, yeah, that's just a huge gap. I mean, I know that San Francisco has the funding sources that we'll never have, but anyway, somehow to bridge that gap, to me, it was pretty dire to find out that rental housing is at any of those types were infeasible. So sorry to ramble about that. There's one other topic I want to just touch on, and this might not be the best place for it, but I'll try and be quick. Just thinking about affordable housing stock in general, and certainly it's great to hear that we're building these new projects, but a lot of the naturally occurring affordable units that we have, the ADUs and the grannies, we have a lot in town. But what I've seen in the past, I think what we're all seeing in the past several years since we've began allowing short-term vacation rentals, is that so many of these units are being taken offline and being converted to vacation rentals. And my neighbors, and I'm sure the council members are all going to hate me for this, but I think something we should talk about, and something we can possibly do, is to sunset that policy in order to reclaim these housing units. These are the things that make neighborhoods great, to have mixed, integrated housing in neighborhoods, to have affordable units in backyards and in houses. And we're just not having those. We're having, people come to town for the weekend. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. Maybe there's another point where we'll get to discuss this, but I think we need to consider sunsetting that policy and reclaiming that housing stock for affordable units. Okay, thanks. That's it for me.
Thank you, Bill. And I hope before the end of the meeting, you share with us where you are, where it's getting dark very quickly. It looks like a beautiful setting. Hey, Derek, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the first part of Bill's comments related to the idea of like, hey, if for sale townhomes or similar products do pencil, is that a route to addressing some of the issues? I'm not sure if you guys have looked at this or have any thoughts on that.
We haven't looked at that specifically in this analysis. I think that a shortcut way of thinking about this might be sort of looking at what's been proposed recently in the city for market rate projects, although that's no guarantee that they'll actually get built. But certainly something like townhomes, as I said, that tends to be a relatively feasible product type. It's maybe not something that you necessarily want right in the core of your town, but it's sort of that gentle density that was referred to earlier, and potentially could pencil more easily. The condo question, getting multifamily condos to pencil in a lot of different market contexts in the Bay Area is often difficult. But while we've been having this conversation, I've been going back to the earlier economic and market analysis that Strategic Economics completed for sort of one of the earliest deliverables that came up from the general plan work. It was a team-wide sort of deliverable. And we looked at building permits from, at the time, 2010 to 2020 in Petaluma. And you know what, I'm just going to share my screen and bear with me for just 1 second here. Won't take long. And what we saw is a pretty simple comparison of just single family and multifamily number of housing units that were permitted. And this comes from a federal source, so there might be some variation from actual local numbers, but still, you can see a lot of the way the city has historically met its housing production goals has been through single family, which I believe also includes townhomes in the way this data was sorted over time. So I just want to, add support that these aren't the only housing products out there, and so there are some other alternatives.
Can I just clarify something with Bill's comment too? Bill, are you still there? He's gone to get a marshmallow.
He's roasting marshmallows.
Yeah. Bill, just for your own, just to put it in a bee in your bonnet. Short-term vacation rentals actually are prohibited from going in ADUs that were built in 2017 or later. And when all the state laws started coming down, making, reducing parking, increasing size of ADUs, decreasing setbacks, the city really saw that as this is really important to keep these. If we're going to be permitting ADUs with all these reduced development criteria, it's really important to keep them in the housing market and not let them become ADUs. So in the code, it does say that if you're ADU, I think it was 2017, but it might, whenever that year was, that new short-term vacation rentals can't be permitted in them. Just FYI.
Thank you. Good to know. I just see a lot of the historic ones in my neighborhood are getting converted, but that's good news. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill and Heather. And I see 4 hands raised. It's 8:25. I do want to make sure we have time to talk a little bit about working groups and also honor our agreement to aim for 9 o'clock closing. So 4 remaining, don't want to stifle the conversation, but just please be aware. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay. To continue on the theme of heresy, and in fact, I feel guilty because I'm going to mention something here that Sharon has talked to me about multiple times. There are types of housing that went away middle of the last century when we probably thought for good. On my list, boarding houses, co-ops, SROs, dorms even. And I know there's no market now. That's not the style, but styles change. I know in going through our zoning code now, I bump into boarding houses once in a while, which always struck me as a relic of the past. But it strikes me that we ought to be at least leaving the door open to those. If a developer comes in with a very clever idea and he thinks the market is changing to accept that because housing is getting so difficult, we ought to be open to that idea and not have it relegated to the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Josh.
Yeah, just real briefly, I guess I'm joining a whole chorus here of folks who are interested in bold and creative proposals. I remember one of the meetings we had earlier this year proposed, what could we do with East Washington? And if we can do it with East Washington, we can do it anywhere. And for me, I found that a fantastic provocation. And so I just echo, let's think creatively, let's think bold, and if we swing for the fences, then maybe we get a little closer to where we actually need to land.
Thank you, Mary.
Just briefly, and Dave kind of touched on it, but I was thinking about how to promote wealth building by having small for sale units in multifamily. Just a way to, if everything's a rental, then there's never an opportunity to get a piece of the pie. And this is an old idea, but if you allow smaller units, and I'm not sure micro units are big enough for this idea, but micro units is another building type Dave didn't mention that we don't really have a code for. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is our just conversion of these empty big box and medium boxes in areas that are already developed. We talk about this, but we've talked about it a long time ago, but to allow for these things to be adapted, and because the infrastructure is all in, is another important way to get housing. That's all.
Thank you. Just a quick note, your housing element does include the exploration of community land trusts and land banks, which are also innovative ways to help families build equity through a different ownership model. So, Ali.
Hi, I'm gonna try and be quick, but I just have a few things that might be a little bit of a reiteration of things people have said before, but I just want to make sure some points are lifted up. So I think in regard to the question about retail on the first floor, just one suggestion is to have a higher floor plate height required on the first floor, not necessarily require it be retail, but that way it could be flexible between retail or residential, and who wouldn't want to live in a unit with 14-foot high ceilings on the ground floor? That would be great. The second, I think Mary touched on this, but adding amenities near site, that was recalling the 15-minute neighborhood presentation from the SDAT that we had earlier that I think a lot of people were really motivated and engaged on. So I think that, and then something in the general plan and maybe zoning ordinance too, but allowing temporary uses to be able to put some of these amenities in, like actually putting in food trucks or something, is really a difficult thing to do, and you can't get temporary uses permitted very easily. You end up going through, like a 3-year-long planning process just to get temporary stuff put in. So some way to be able to add those amenities so that the land values can, I guess, go up and support some of this development. Parking maximums, I don't think anybody touched on that yet. I know there was a lot of parking discussion in the reports. And I think just by having a policy of parking maximums instead of minimums, at least allows that flexibility. And so if market rate developers want to pay for the, the parking and think that makes a good product, then they're allowed to do that, but they're not required to. And the last thing I wanted to mention is inclusionary. So I don't think the report was super clear, but it is a policy now that market rate developers have to do on-site inclusionary, or else they have to go to the city council and ask for, mitigation. And I think it needs to be easier to allow developers to pay the in lieu fees so that we can get more funding for 100% affordable housing. And I think that the fees need to be, analyzed and updated often to make sure that they're the right fees. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you for that well-informed, experience-based perspective, Ali. Thank you. Brent.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge Derek and the team at Strategic Economics for a really excellent and well-written report presentation. It was very informative. I was struck by the fact that market rate housing wasn't penciling out, and the variety of policy options available for both market rate and affordable housing. And really what I came down to my final thinking here, and I think others share it, which is, whatever city policies are part of the general plan, whatever city new policies are part of the general plan, they need to overwhelmingly target building out affordable housing. The RHNA numbers show that we certainly do not need more above the median or whatever it is, the high end housing. It looks like we've already met our next target because we overbuilt during the previous period. So, whatever city policy should definitely target any moderate and low income housing. I also want to acknowledge Mary's point about housing for moderate and low income that utilizes ownership as a means for providing that housing and for building wealth. Petaluma has the Petaluma First Time Homebuyers Program, which has been an excellent program. I know from personal experience that program has benefited me and a lot of my neighbors to provide affordable housing. So that I would urge the city to double down on that type of housing option for moderate and low income housing. That's it.
Thank you, Brent, and thank you, everybody. Lots of, as usual, very thoughtful comments from the GPAC. Last call for any comments before we move on to the final agenda item. Okay, well, thank you again, Derek, for the great analysis and the nice, concise, clear presentation and fantastic comments. Thanks also a nod to Michelle, who's behind the scenes taking notes, making sure we capture all the good ideas, which we'll be sure to consider as we continue to build out the policy frameworks and for the land use alternatives. So with that, I'm going to shift to the next agenda item, the GPAC Working Group Refresh. Let me share screen again. And I'll apologize in advance. My computer's behaving like it's about to die on me, so hopefully it makes it through the next few minutes. Let me just move here through. So mentioned this in the connected to Brian shared earlier. We want to talk tonight a bit about how we are thinking of using GPAC working groups moving forward. A little context, and then I want to just refresh all of our memories on how we originally thought about the GPAC working groups and how we've used them so far. But first, the larger context. As Brian noted earlier, the upcoming phases are really some heavy topics focused initially on flood resilience, informed by the updated flood and sea level rise modeling and mapping, which informs and has a direct connection to a broader discussion about other, both land use related to flood resilience, but also this bigger discussion about land use alternatives, which is really a discussion about the future settlement patterns for Petaluma, which is also very relevant to tonight's conversation. And we want to get through that stuff to kind of get that solid understanding, which then we can come back and circle back to the policy frameworks and make sure our thinking about land use supporting infrastructure is aligned with the policy across the full range of general plan topics. And so as we thought about that, we thought these heavy topics coming up soon are really good overall whole GPAC sorts of discussions, why we've thought of them as topics of and focus of upcoming GPAC meetings as a whole group, and much of that in person, because a lot of it is looking at maps and talking through what different options may look like in future scenarios. But then when we come back after that to the policy frameworks, as you know, I think there's 14 different topics. Back last fall and earlier part of this year, you got presentations on many of them and provided lots of fantastic preliminary feedback on the ideas that were being considered at the time. All of that was used along with extensive city review and comment to prepare public drafts, which are kind of in process right now. And so we thought as we bring those back to you and the public, the most effective, efficient way to do that is through working groups that can take a deep dive and a focused look at each of these policy framework topics. So that's kind of the context for this agenda item. So quickly, before we get to some ideas we have about how to organize working groups moving forward, I just wanted to refresh all of our memory about how we've been using them so far. And so we formed these, I believe it was a year and a half ago or so, with the idea that recognizing that there's so many active, well-informed members of the Petaluma community, that one of the unique roles the GPAC members can play is working with those community members directly and spending time outside of GPAC meetings, talking with them, brainstorming ideas, exploring options, and bringing that all back to the GPAC to inform the broader general plan update conversation. So that was really their fundamental purpose. We know it's already a big commitment to be a GPAC member, and so we wanted to make sure people understood these are voluntary and that people can participate in an ongoing way or ad hoc, depending on their other commitments and life situation. We did want to make sure each GPAC working group had 2 members, with one being identified as the coordinator and another the co-coordinator. Beyond that, they're welcome to involve other community members, have open meetings, that sort of thing, whatever worked well for the focus at hand. And then also just recognize that given capacity, these largely had to be self-directed, self-coordinated, and self-facilitated by those GPAC members who were coordinating. And so lots of fantastic work has been done by the working groups so far. So we started them February of last year. Many of them had a lot of meetings in the spring and summer, culminating in some very helpful recommendations, all of which were looked at very closely as we began to think about specific goals and policies for the general plan. And then those ideas were brought back for broader GPAC discussion. And then in addition, there's been opportunities both with the housing element and, as Brian mentioned earlier, more recently with some of the sea level rise modeling and mapping, to engage working group members directly in a closer look at some of the ongoing city work. And that has proven incredibly helpful for the city and the rest of the planning team to develop specific work products. So with that in mind, looking ahead, we're just kind of trying to preemptively plan for when the public draft policy frameworks come out and prepare ourselves. So a lot of information on this slide, but it's really quite simply on the left-hand column, the original composition, well, the original groups that we formed and those who were members. The italicized names are folks who are no longer on the GPAC, either because they were elected to other office or had other personal commitments. The middle column is what we're thinking might be the most useful way to organize the working groups moving forward. And that's very much informed by the right-hand column, which is a reasonable clustering of some of the policy framework topics. And so what we thought we'd do tonight, well, actually, one last thing. We don't expect a commitment tonight. City staff will be following up by email after tonight's meeting to gauge your interest, I think, much in a similar way that we did first time we initiated the working group. So don't feel compelled to make any kind of commitment tonight. We know there's lots of other considerations that go into this. But we did want to share these ideas with you and get you thinking about which of these topics you might have time and interest in focusing on, probably starting really towards the latter part of this year and into 2024. I'll pause there. I'll see if Brian or Heather have something to add, anything I've missed.
No, also don't feel like you have to memorize this slide. I see everyone looking very intently. So what we'll do is we'll send out an email and include this slide so you're remembering where you were and maybe where you'd like to be as we kind of reorganize and reconstitute these working groups. So we'll send an email out probably next week and just kind of ask for people to follow up and let us know which ones, if any, you want to be on, maybe what's your first choice. Obviously, if everyone is just dying to do engineering, which I was kind of joking because I have a feeling that might not be everyone's first choice, but maybe it is. Maybe, we'll have to, obviously we don't want 20 people saying one working group and then, mobility gets nobody. So we'll have to look at maybe what are your first 3 requests or something like that. So we'll send that out and then have you respond and we'll start putting those together. And hopefully everyone can join in as much or as little participation as fits with their life and as they're interested in.
One other quick piece I realized I forgot is there's this plus what Brian mentioned earlier, the opportunity in the nearer term to collaborate with the Climate Action Commission on a deep dive review of the Climate Action Plan, the GHG reduction, the greenhouse gas reduction measures. So that'll be part of the mix too. And I assume the city will make that all part of a single email inviting interest in all of the above or none of the above as your desire and time allows.
And I think it's also important just this doesn't mean you won't be able to participate in any discussion or review or comments on any of the other policy framework. It's just a massive amount of documentation, and this is so important to go deep on. And so we just want to allow people to go deep on those things that they have particular interest or experience or and then report out, very similar to how we did when we started these policy frameworks, when we were looking at recommendations for policies. So just really want to make sure everyone knows it's the touch isn't just limited to the working groups. It's just kind of a different level from the working groups to then report out to the larger group.
Thank you, Heather. I see several hands either eagerly willing and ready to volunteer or they're really baffled and have a lot of questions. Chris, go ahead.
Sure. So just, it would be great once people, pick their lane to have this posted someplace publicly. And is there help with facilitating location? I mean, if we want to encourage other people in the community to come join in, it probably would be good to have a place rather than, my backyard for people to get together. And, I could see myself wanting to pop into these other ones. So it seems like there needs to be some sort of general organization. Is that part of the thinking of this whole thing?
We can definitely explore that, Chris. Definitely putting them up on the general plan website, the working groups. That's yes. And we'll start thinking about location or help with that. Last time it kind of more organically happened, I think, but we'll see what resources we might have.
Well, I think, Chris, what's piqued my interest too is I had always seen this portion to be, as the advisory committee, bringing your thoughts and sort of helping form prior to, there's sort of this sequencing to inform a larger discussion, but that's not to say that's the only way to do it. So we can start thinking about, is there sort of this more larger discussion? If I think that's where you're getting at, but if you're talking about sort of closed to the GPAC.
Well, there was some, I mean, I think it's both. There's some, there were some comments earlier, I think from you guys about, being champions out in the community, talking to people, talking to other people who care about the same thing. So I'm going, okay, sure. So if that's part of it, we should figure out a way to do that. And then I think it is good for, the housing working group, we had a pre-GPAC meeting, just to kind of get clear in the concept. I didn't have hardly anything to say tonight, but it was valuable to help me get my head wrapped around what was going to happen tonight. So it doesn't have to be just one way or the other, but if we're going to include the public, we need to figure out how to do that. or decide, well, in this case, the working groups are just going to be working groups. I don't have an opinion, but you guys mentioned the public, and I thought, oh boy, like that needs to come into the equation as we just try to figure out this going forward.
I was remiss. I should clarify too. So a couple of things. One is our thought is that the working groups take these deep dives on specific policy frameworks during the public review of the policy frameworks. And so during that time, there'll be, workshops, orientations, online formats for people to provide input. And so there'll be lots of opportunities for the general public to review, look at, comment on the policy frameworks. So the working groups we're seeing in part as kind of supplemental to that work. And if you recall from when we first did the working groups, the idea was to not put the burden of the working groups to engage the entire community on a topic. It was to identify those key stakeholders, people who we knew already had knowledge, interest, experience with the topic, to take that deep dive and take a look in a focused way, as opposed to putting the onus of broad community engagement on these working groups. That was never the expectation. So. Mary, then John, then Bill Reiner.
Okay, Ron, that helped me trim my question, your explanation. I was, first of all, curious about the efforts that were put forth with the original working groups and how that, because I kind of liked it, for example, possibly switch groups because we did so much with our working group. I want to know what's going to happen with that because if we don't feel like it's getting any sort of traction, it's hard to get excited about the next working group. So what's going to happen with what we already did? Rest assured it's going to be looked at, and then I can go look at another group, or do I need to stick with this group? Because if I don't, it's all going away. Whoops. Turning that off.
No, you don't have to stick with the same working group. We only put the names up there as a reminder, so there's no expectation that you necessarily would. That being said, some people may very well want to maintain focus on a limited number of areas. In terms of what was done with the recommendations from the GPAC group, so we've mentioned this before, but we took those and used them to inform initially strategy conversations that consultant team members had with city staff. And then again, when the consultants working from that and the GPAC working group recommendations put pencil to paper to generate ideas, that was one of the primary sources for ideas for goals, strategies, policies, other approaches to achieving the vision and guiding principles that have been adopted. And then they were, as you may recall, when we brought back those ideas generated by the consultant team to a series of GPAC meetings in the fall and early part of this year, we always here's what we heard from you and here's how it was incorporated into these ideas. And so it's been very much a driver for everything that's been done with the policy frameworks to date. But again, I think it's a totally legitimate approach if you're a member of a formal working group to get those recommendations out and use them as a checklist to make sure everything's been covered. Other people have been doing that, but certainly that'd be a very appropriate approach to part of a review of a policy framework. So excellent point, Mary. John Shribs, welcome. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, you're no longer a GPAC member.
I'm no longer the GPAC people first. Yes.
You caught me. I almost forgot that you're now a council member. Welcome. Bill Reinert, and then, Bill Reinert.
Great. Thanks, Ron. I want to start with a plea to Mary to not jump off the working group. But I get it. We did a lot of work. And that sort of fuels one of my comments in that, we engaged a lot of stakeholders in the particular open space and natural resources working group. And of course, we lost John and Janice to council. But the consultant brought back a report that we felt was not reflective of all of the outreach that we did. And And so, we've been looking forward to this as an opportunity to see the draft policy framework and to respond, or, at least to use our original work as a checklist. But so I'm kind of hoping that Mary, you're still on board with that, and John, you too. So really my big comment is that I think to make the most of this effort, and we've all been looking forward to this as what we figure is the useful part of the working groups, is review of the policy frameworks. I would like to see a kind of a more detailed timeline. What's the rollout schedule? Which elements will be rolled out? How many at a time? What will be the process for development? Will there be working group review, then another draft, and then public review, or is it just one review? Let's have kind of a timeline for, or a specific process for review of each of these elements, and that the GPAC and the working group members can be aware of this so that we can sort of coordinate the effort and focus our time where it's, best spent and where to get into our schedule. So looking for a detailed schedule of the rollout, the amount of time we would expect to have to review a draft policy framework, and what will be the steps in the process. So I think that would be really great if you can give us a more detailed roadmap, either at the next meeting or sometime before we have to launch this effort. Okay, thanks a lot.
That's a great comment, Bill. We don't have the specific timeline at this point because various frameworks are at various stages of development. But by the time the public drafts are ready, we certainly can have that. What we do know is generally the process to answer that part of your question. And so the idea is to make all of them available at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, a variety of means designed to help people understand what's in them, provide feedback. In addition to the GPAC's work, the plan is to also bring them to the relevant commissions, committees, and boards at the same time. And the idea is to bring all of that input, GPAC, public, boards, together back to the GPAC for final recommendations, which would then go to PC and on to council to kind of close out that phase of the project. All that guidance then would inform the admin draft of the general plan, which, as you know, would then ultimately become a public draft before going into the adoption process. So this is, one in what is a series of 1, 2, 3, 4 opportunities for you and the public to weigh in on specific strategies and policy ideas for the general plan. Does that answer that part of your question? He's roasting marshmallows again.
Yeah, no, I think that does answer. I would like to just see it in writing so we can get a sense of, I'd like to spread it out on a calendar and actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. By the time we get there, we'll definitely have that information for you. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Ron.
Brian, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to add to that?
Oh, you said yes, and that was going to be my response. So I'll leave it at that.
Any other GPAC comment at this point? If not, city staff, I see a couple hands raised by members of the public. Would you like to open public comment again?
Yes, please.
Okay, Daniel, can you do that for us?
I'm not sure that we need the timer or anything. I mean, I'm hoping that John and Susan, if you have something on the working groups, keep it. Right. I mean, I'm just trying to not be quite so formal to get comments and.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in the interest of time, let's see. So John, go ahead.
Okay, I'll keep this short. The working group, the engineering, even though I worked on the other one, the open space naturals, I think the engineering group is going to be a huge topic coming down the line with climate change, because we specifically work on all of those our highly needed facilities. We're talking about improving our soccer fields. Artificial turf just got rejected by the rec group. We have facilities. We have both police station and fire station need to get built somewhere, possibly the fairgrounds. And on the noise level, we have lots of things going on with noise, whether it be the racetrack, the smart train, car shows that are going on late at night, and other things. So there's lots of noise issues that we need to worry about, including like the cement plant is worried about noise and impact on neighbors that are going to be moving next to them. So the engineering and facilities, the swim center, the Lucchese Center, all needing improvements. That's a huge topic. And then the biggest one, of course, is going to be the electrification of getting PG&E to do what's needed to electrify the city. And then the discussions coming up on solar panels and the battery storage that's coming up, along with improving our entire grid and microgrids that we might want to do. Those are all huge topics, and it should be very exciting for folks from this group to join in on. And I wish I could be participating, but I think because I'm a city council now, I won't be able to participate, but hopefully I'll be able to give some feedback to folks on several of these topics along the way. So that's my comment for the moment.
Great. Thank you, Council Member. And Susan, will turn the floor over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I sent an email to Bill Reinhardt while you all were talking. So Bill, please check your emails. I'd really like to see the open space and actually natural environment, not natural resources, which is an extractive term many of us in conservation are trying to move away from using. So open space and natural environment working group, and encourage others who feel a connection to our environment here in Petaluma to potentially be interested in revisiting that. I think there's a lot of additional consideration that could be given to recommending, literally recommending open space policy, looking at the city and quadrants for existing open space and natural features, how the areas are connected or not connected in Petaluma, what the priorities are. And of course, wildlife corridors are extremely important, always have been, but more so than ever now with the climate emergency. And our consulting team unfortunately got that 100% incorrect in the original iteration that was provided to you. And that happens to be a mapping project that I've been working on for several years for Sonoma County and Marin County, and how Petaluma has wildlife corridors and how our environment fits into the larger picture. I think we also need to look at that too. So I'm very interested in participating in that work group if it does reopen. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Daniel. It's just about 9 o'clock. Ryan, would you mind closing us out?
I will. Just 30 seconds. I see we're joined by our four-legged friends here, so want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much. I mean, the fact that we're still holding strong at 28 participants is pretty impressive, and shows the commitment and dedication of this group. So really looking forward to it. I'll close with just two, this is all about community. We have 2 members that aren't with us here on the screen today. And so Christina Paul had sent through email, and I think it was just a little buried in her correspondence, but she's sort of in transit this week. Her and her family made a really tough decision to relocate overseas, and so that's why you're going to start to see a lot more of Heather and myself. So Christina is still very much a part of the team, albeit on a completely different time zone. And so you'll still see her. I mean, I've been seeing emails pop up the last half hour from her. And so she's very much an active participant, but obviously just it'll be challenging to have a sort of front-facing role here. And then the other one I'll just close with Commissioner Kevin Kelly, who many of you know. He is previously a GPAC member, current more recent addition to our planning commission, and so just sort of scratching the surface, but just did want to share, if you do know him, know his family, he's going through pretty significant medical emergency, and so he has not been able to connect with us directly and participate on the commission. And so we've just gotten some news from his wife just on his medical condition. So I just, she was okay with our sharing that out. And so if you do know her, know him, you'd like to just connect with them, just wanted to just mention that news here. And so again, it takes a village, it takes the community. And so again, just note of gratitude and thanks again. And much more to come. But for now, let's sign off and everyone have a good night, and we'll talk soon. Thanks all.
Thank you.